I suggest we now transition to the panel discussion. And I've got some specific questions to Roz to start off. And then I've got a couple broad questions that I'll ask each of the panelists to weigh in on. So Roz, from the audience, there's questions around the topic you just raised about the safety of feed waste and using that in aquaculture, and how to ensure the safety of food, not just the quantity of food.
Yeah, that's often a question that comes up, particularly when you put up bone meal and blood meal. We've gone through this before, but also with the trimmings. I mean, we're not using the same species into the same species. That's one aspect of it, is that so that is monitored. Most of this waste that is going through this circular system is by feed companies that are highly, testing these different feeds, and they have gone back to those earlier episodes, particularly in the UK, where they really need to ensure the food safety on that side. I think where there's equal, so it's not the same species, and it's rigorously tested and so forth, but there's a lot of very, very informal systems out here. And if anyone has seen aquaculture systems around the world, in low-income settings, that's throwing human manure or livestock manure right into the ponds and so forth, and then they offer you a dish of seafood for lunch, and you're like, oh, I don't. This is how they fertilize their ponds, and it happens everywhere. And so I think food safety is a big question that we need to ask, and also as more plant-based proteins and micronutrients are being put into feeds, to what extent are they carrying some of the toxics from pesticides and other residues? So these are the food safety issues are big, and they're not really solved. There's so many unregulated systems, to be honest, as well as very highly regulated systems.
Thank you. And I want to ask each of the panelists, as I said, two broad questions. The first is, all of you talked about complex adaptive systems. And as you know, in complex adaptive systems, knowing in detail one component of the system doesn't tell you how the system functions. And all of you talked about that in various ways. And given we've got a fair number of people online who are interested in research, from each of your perspectives, what are some of the key research needs where we know that we're going to need to understand more to be able to understand the system? As you know, I work in health, and so I see this kind of valley of death between work on crop yields and then the work on nutrition, that there is a large gap there that needs to be filled. But I really want to hear from each of you where you see some critical research needs that need to be filled in the short term to get a better handle on resiliency. Anybody want to start with that?
I'll go first if you like, Christy. I mean, I think, I think we have focused a lot in the research that's happened about food security, and we tried to make this point in the IPCC chapter. I don't know whether we did it all together successfully, but I think we have to look at the consumption side of food security, and what are the factors which really control or influence the consumption of food, and move away from this the sort of production paradigm of food security. I think we need to try and very much integrate these two things, and that's what we were trying to do with the way of looking at how you could also look at the production emissions from production, but the production of food, but also linking it to how that affects health and other aspects. So I think there needs to be a serious program of research, because I mean, I think that many research councils, they pay lip service to this, but then this kind of research falls down between the gaps of being science or being social science, and so I've seen this in Europe. I mean, you can put in multidisciplinary projects, and they fall down the gaps between because they're assessed by mainly technically qualified scientists. So I think there has to be a brave, there has to be a brave research council which says, no, we're going to start looking at really this link between production and consumption. And there are examples. I mean, I mentioned John Ingram in Oxford, where they did a study of the food system of Oxford. We did a study where we looked at the food systems of 3 capital cities, Tokyo, Canberra, and Copenhagen. And you can really learn some stuff from that.
Thank you. Roz?
Yeah, I'll follow up on some of the really good questions that were asked before, but when you look at the blue food area, a lot of research has obviously gone on into capture fisheries, overfishing, and different methods of managing fisheries. And in aquaculture, almost all of the papers, the vast majority of papers, research papers, and funding has gone into these high valued commodities like salmon and shrimp and tuna, other marine fish that we eat here in the United States, for example. Whereas the biggest growth has been in those freshwater systems. And those systems produced by a wide range of smallholders. A smallholder can be someone that has that little pond that I showed you in the picture in Orissa, or it can actually be someone that has a relatively small pond, is a real entrepreneur raising catfish or tilapia for sales into the urban markets that are booming. And in South Asia, we have seen supply chains for these fish just growing and developing on their own without any impetus from government policy, almost despite government policy. There's just a demand that's driving these things. If you could put even a fraction of the research money that's going into these high valued crops into these lower valued systems that are really seem to be improving nutrition and food security in the world, but there are so many unknowns. Food safety, what are the food safety issues, the climate impacts, the environmental impacts of these systems? None of these systems are in certification programs, for example. There's no benefits to the producers to do that, really. So there's a lot that could be learned there that really, I think, would drive resiliency for most people. For whom? For most of the undernourished.
Cindy?
Good, yeah, I'll kind of jump in there. I really appreciate the points that have been made so far by the other panelists. I think when I kind of look at it from my window on the world with respect to what key research is needed, I think it's about the human factor. I think we need more socioeconomic type studies to really understand how to go about implementing change, or how to get change, how to get producers to really adopt new production paradigms. I mean, that's a it's an experiment there in psychology, sociology, culture. It's very transdisciplinary. In essence, I mean, there's a reason why, and from my perspective, we've got a lot of science that shows these production practices work. We know we need to go there. But how do we get farmers to really take that plunge, make that change? And in the past, if you talk to a Gabe or if you talk to a Will Harris, they'll tell you it's because we almost went broke. I mean, it was a crisis that stimulated them to embrace change. How do we do that without the crises? How do we get these farmers to embrace this without the stress-inducing, I'm going to go broke tomorrow if I don't make change, kind of a paradigm shift? So I'd like to see that kind of work done. And I think it's a systems-based approach. We have to look at that from that perspective. There's a reason why we have such low adoption rates. It's like cover crops and that type of thing in California. And if you look at Iowa, they have like 3 times the use of cover crops in that state. What's going on there? Why are those 2 states so different? And, just in a very cursory look at this, there is a really potent, powerful farmer-to-farmer network called Practical Farmers of Iowa. They're very effective. It's a farmer-to-farmer kind of program. And, they've got each other to kind of lean on, and it resolves that whole peer pressure thing where you're going to get talked about at the coffee shop if you start to do something weird. I mean, there's that culture is real. And it is a problem to overcome paradigm shift. And the Practical Farmers of Iowa get around that because they are them. they are there and they support each other and make that happen. The one other thing that I would also like to see from a research perspective is a better understanding of what makes really good policy for change. We know we need a global change, a global shift in our food production system, and it can be driven by policy. And how do we make that happen? I mean, there's got to be good examples of that, globally, where there are, systems that have implemented different policies that supported change. I'd like to see that study done, some case studies on how to make that happen so that we can get busy in Sacramento down here in California ourselves and make that happen. I do appreciate what's going on with California Department of Food and Agriculture. I think that they have made more progress in terms of transitioning more farmers down that path than any other state that I'm aware of. So that's just a big shout out to Jenny and Karen Ross and the team there at CDFA.
Those are great, and I'd like to tie several of your comments together because those are basically the second question I wanted to ask. Is all of you talked about the need for incentives to more quickly transition our food system. And Cindy in particular and John talked about the importance of consumption as part of that transition. And looking at consumer choice, consumer demand, you raise those kinds of issues. Roz, you raised that as well. Thinking about waste and having a bigger table of the work that's been done, of course, has been done primarily by the scientific community, but it's not broadly engaging across all of the stakeholders. Dietitians, for example, are an important piece of that. And as you think about the transitions that you all talked about of how to more explicitly incorporate the consumption aspects into that transition, and if you have some thoughts on that, that would be interesting for all of us to hear. And we don't have to take it in the same order. Anybody can start who wants to, or I'll start with Cindy and move backwards.
Great. Maybe you could frame that question for me just a little bit. This is a question about how do we transition consumer choice? How do we bring those people to the table to really understand what we need them to understand with respect to a new vision for the food system? Did I understand that? Or maybe help frame that for me just a touch?
Sure, sorry, it was a bit rambling there in a moment, but it is thinking about how to more quickly convert our food system, the incentives to make that happen, and that's an issue that you raised was incentives. And one of those incentives is around consumption. And
Right.
are there particular approaches, are there particular research questions, are there best practices you've identified in your research that you can bring to our discussion around using consumption as a leverage for changing the agricultural food system a bit faster?
Right, right. And we have been funded to do some nutrient density type work, and I do think that's a driver for consumers. They are, one, they're conscientious. They want to know how their food is produced from an animal welfare perspective, from a ecological perspective, greenhouse gas emissions. They also want to know that it's healthy for them. So that work needs to be done. It's not well delineated to look at that. We know that there has been a change. We're seeing more chronic illness. We know that we've been degrading our soil. We've lost 60% of our soil carbon. We know that the nutrients, in our food is declining over time because we've mined our soils, and we've lost the biological component of our soils. So, those are things that are concerning, I think, to the consuming public. So to be able to I guess communicate, what effective change might do for the health and wellness of the food system in itself and for food, I think would be a driver for many consumers. I mean, we are seeing a lot of successes with brands that claim they're more nutritious, brands that the EOV, Regen Organic. I mean, there's several brands out there that are really branding themselves as being that much better and driving a higher retail dollar because of it. And I think the more momentum that we get around that nutrient density, I think we can drive the industry from the consumer perspective, as you suggest. I do think that a lot more work needs to be done. There are pieces in the literature, but those dots have not been very well connected. There are a few review articles that have done a nice job, but we just need a lot more work in that area so that we can be very, very confident in moving forward with the idea that this style climate smart agriculture is really good for food and nutrition in society.
I'd like to pick up for a second and just put a note that one of the issues you raised is that the producers are incentivized by how much they produce, but not by the food density.
That's absolutely true.
And that goes back to the policy question that you raised earlier.
Right. So
go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that, yeah, I think incentivizing producers to go down that right path is good. I think brand programs kind of support that. They add value to a consumer, so they're willing to pay a little more for a product that they feel has been produced in a superior way. So I think those two things are really important with respect to transforming our food system.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. John, Roz?
Yeah, I think the consumer issue is hugely important, and on the aquatic food side, if we look particularly at the U.S. and Europe, I mean, I agree with Cindy completely that consumers are taking a much bigger stance at the quality and food safety of their foods. But it's a very confusing world out there. I don't think consumers really know what they're getting to a large extent. And in the aquatic food area, I think some of the big risks and another question popped up on chat, is how much antibiotics are actually used in aquaculture, for example, and what is the resistance then impacts on human consumers from that. It's a big issue if we look, but it's very diverse. If you look at salmon production in Norway, they've gone to almost zero antibiotics and more vaccines. In Chile, they're using huge amounts of antibiotics, and a lot of that fish comes into our supermarkets. And so what do the consumers really understand of where their food is coming from or not is a huge and important issue. We also see it in capture fisheries on mercury and tuna, and the need for the Marine Stewardship Council, for example, that has really tried to identify sustainable foods. So we are seeing progress. Big retailers, Walmart, Costco, and others are starting to only market sustainable seafood from farms and from the wild. But it still accounts for a very small fraction over the overall aquatic foods that are produced, maybe less than 2% actually. And it's mostly high valued commodities for consumers that are really investigating and understand this. On the other hand, overall, the consumer and citizen demand for more sustainable production systems and sustainable supply chains has really, I think, driven at least the aquaculture sector to have to look at sustainability at all costs when there's any transparency in the system, when it's not just for a local market in Bangladesh, for example, but for a globally traded market. Or even in China, the consumers are so worried about food safety that they're getting a lot of local certification programs for their seafood because of food safety again. So it's the big driver if there can be enough collective action among consumers and enough knowledge for them to drive change.
And I'll draw out one of the lessons that you are highlighting is that consumers need to understand the difference between resilience and sustainable. We're talking about resilient systems, and many of our practices in the short term will not facilitate long-term resilient systems.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that clarification.
John?
Yeah, I have 2 points really. One is about consumption and what the European Commission has done. I don't know whether this happens in the States now, but on every piece of food that you buy in a supermarket or wherever, you can see what the constitution of that food is. You can see what its protein content is. You can see what its sugar content is. You can see what its weight is and the energy content and all that kind of stuff. And that's been very helpful. On every packet you buy or any tin of tomatoes you buy, you can see this information. And it's certainly influenced the way I buy food or we buy food and changed my diet, in fact. So that was a basis of, if you get good information, then you can make informed choices about, you know, are you going to eat a lot of sugar today, or are you not going to eat a lot of sugar today? The second thing I would say would be consumption. I mean, there have been times in the past, I mean, if you look at Naomi Oreskes' books about, I mean, how did people stop consuming tobacco? I mean, what was the process that stopped people consuming and smoking tobacco? That was I mean, there were huge fights about that. The tobacco companies fought back tooth and nail to get people to continue smoking, and they still do that. But in, you know, in many Western countries, it's extremely unusual to see people smoking these days. And what was the process that meant that people changed their view about smoking tobacco? And my third point, really, and my really sort of mega point, because I think that with respect to climate change, we think of climate change as can be solved by microeconomic measures. They cannot be solved by microeconomic measures. It can't. It's a huge macroeconomic problem. And I think we have to move away from the idea of putting a value on flows of things to putting a value on the stocks of things. So we have to value stocks of things higher than we value flows of things, because the whole of the, I mean, this again, I go back to World War II and the post-World War II economy. That was put into place because they wanted to stimulate the flows of goods around the world. And now I think we need to think about perhaps the situation pre-World War II, where there was a gold standard. I mean, there was a way in which stocks were valued more than I mean, the value of currencies was based on how much gold you had in your vaults. And I think we need to start thinking about that we need, if you like, a carbon standard. We need to value our economy on the basis of our carbon stocks, both fossil and non-fossil. And we need to think of things like oil as very old underground forests. I mean, we say we should, you know, preserve the Amazonian rainforest, but I mean, the oil in the Middle East is only very, very, very old forests. And we need to apply the same kind of thinking to preserving these forests, underground liquid forests in parts of the world, as we do to thinking about preserving the rainforest. We need to think about carbon as basically the basis of the values of our economies.
These are all great comments. And one thing I should have said at the beginning is I'm sure each one of you has responses to what the others have said. So if you want to use the raise hand function, so I know you'd like to comment back on somebody else's. This is supposed to be a discussion, not just an individual set of interventions. Does anybody want to come back on this question after hearing what the three of you had to say before I go on to another question? No? We're good? But if you do want to raise your hand, I think that would be great.
I would only say that I've learned a lot. I mean, that's been a positive part of the day for me. I mean, it was very interesting to hear about. I didn't know anything about Blue Food. It's been very interesting to hear from them, and also to hear about some of the nice stories and good stories of things in what's happening to farmers in the United States. I mean, you know, in my mind as a crop physiologist, it makes me think about should one be moving away towards things like perennial wheat, for example, I mean, where you don't replant every year, and if you are going to move towards systems which are really trying to store carbon in the soil, then that shifts agriculture considerably. I mean, you know, the French, the INRA French, they have this 4 per 1,000 idea that you can increase the carbon content in the soil by 4 parts per 1,000 every year. Well, it's okay putting the carbon into the soil, but you've got to keep it there. And therefore, it does mean that there are other agricultural practices that you need to do to keep the carbon in the soil. And you know, this may involve using herbicides, for example, in conservation agriculture. So there are some things which are maybe not clear. I mean, there are some trade-offs that have to happen, I think, basically.
Cindy, it looked like you wanted to come in on this.
I would agree with all of that. I think we are going to have to, change the way in which we farm, not only the way in which we farm, but also, farm products. And I do think switching over to a more perennial system makes a lot of sense. The problem with that, is the infrastructure requirements, because right now, corn farmers are set up with corn harvesters and dryers and infrastructure that's associated with corn production. And they're always trying to optimize to, decrease the amount of they want to put as much corn over their fixed cost as possible. I mean, that's their whole motivation. So switching to a perennial cropping system, that's a whole different system. That's going to require new equipment. That's going to require new infrastructure. So, it's not any small detail, but by the same token, it needs to happen. So how are we going to go there? How are we going to go there? And I think that there's been lots of experimentation trying to convert annual crops into a perennial, which would be fabulous. But, then, maybe that would be, if we could had a perennial corn, for instance, I mean, that might be interesting. Or do we want to go to a different system altogether that kind of moves us away from, that kind of a system, so that it's not so much about livestock feed and it's more about vegetable production for human consumption. Those kinds of shifts would be fascinating to talk about, to model, and to determine, what the true impact would be on farmers and the farming communities, because they have a lot invested. I mean, they've got a lot of skin in this game, and so they're the ones that are going to be impacted a lot with those kinds of policy changes. Hey, and I did want to touch on something that John talked about with labels. We do label here as well, and clearly that's I think an important thing. We have a lot of label readers here. A lot of consumers are very in tune with what's in that label, but what's in that label is kind of up for debate. Protein, carbohydrate, fat, that type of thing, maybe some minerals and vitamins, maybe. But what, some of the nutritional communities that are making these decisions on what goes into these labels may not really recognize some of these very helpful components or constituents that we see, like in tomatoes with lycopene. You can do that because FDA says it's okay. You can put lycopene on your label, but USDA, the FSIS, no way. So if you've got a grass-fed beef product that is much higher in omega-3 and CLA and vitamin A, you can't put that on your label, because the USDA doesn't recognize those things as nutrients, even though we know they're really good for human health. So we've got some policy issues that we need to resolve. I mean, those to me are, they're problems, they're roadblocks to really moving this, shifting this paradigm.
Well, I mean, I would say that the way this was introduced by the European community, I mean, this is the same regardless of whether you're in Ireland or whether you're in Greece. You get the same information. You need a community.
Roz?
And yeah, just to pick up, and I've learned a lot, obviously, from John and Cynthia too. And as we think about the blue foods, there's been so much technology transfer from actually livestock and agriculture into this field of aquaculture. And a lot of it is positive, but some of it is negative in terms of the industrial systems. And so will we see, instead of literally 500 different species being farmed in all of these different types of systems I showed in the slides, will there be just shrimp and salmon and tilapia and catfish and go down the same road that we've had before? That's what we want to avoid in terms of resiliency, really. But how will that actually happen? I really like thinking about the issues of redundancy and how to build that into the system as aquaculture is growing so rapidly. And also regenerative agriculture. I have one student from Hainan, China, who's looking at this system. I said, watch the talk on regenerative agriculture and try to apply the principles to your systems in China for aquaculture. What would be the analogies, and how do you build on that from the start, so you don't need to transform from a bad system into a good system later? How do you think about the capabilities that would actually be needed? Of course, there's a lot of work that's been done over the past 20 years on kind of agroecological approaches in aquaculture. But what are the incentives? Again, the human side does come in so importantly. What are the incentives to pick up and do these? Farmers are going to usually go for the methods that are economically most profitable for them, that are easiest to use. It's really hard to manage very complex systems as a farmer, and where their sort of risk return ratios are going to be fairly good, and what they have access to. Not everyone has access to the same information. And so all of these aspects are really coming into me thinking about resiliency as I move forward on the blue food. I'll have to get these two other speakers into our blue food assessment, I think, very soon. They're so linked with the terrestrial system.
Well, we've got quite a good series of questions from the audience. And I'd like to back up a little bit. We've been talking a lot about consumers. And one of the questions is, April Renee proposed focusing on individuals as citizens rather than as consumers could help reframe the dialogue around sustainability. A citizen has a broader set of responsibilities than a consumer. Does anybody have any reactions, perspectives, insights?
Well, I just go back to the question about how did it become socially unacceptable to light tobacco and smoke it? I mean, how did that happen? And it was because people acted as citizens. I mean, it's absolutely correct. I mean, there were significant citizen movements, and also they could see the Surgeon General's reports on smoking and health, and it was a concerted effort, I think, and of course having citizen values is very, very important. There are many places around the world at the moment where citizen values are undervalued enormously, yes, it would be, if people were becoming more civil, would be a very good idea. What did Mahatma Gandhi said about the West? They said, "What do you think about Western civilization?" He said, "I think it would be a very good idea." That was Mahatma Gandhi.
Right. And I really appreciate those comments, especially about smoking and how it became very unfashionable very quickly. And I think it was the data, clearly, but I think really what pushed that over the hill was art and film and advertisement, and that aspect of our society really stepped it up. Some of those commercials, on the anti-smoking commercials, they were very effective. Because it had been, the Marlboro Man and how sexy he was, and suddenly it became this individual that had the tracheotomy and had to speak through a box, and that was effective marketing. So maybe that's what we need to employ. And
but sorry, Cynthia, but you get the same with obesity. I mean, you could do the same kind of thing with obesity. When your BMI is 39 or 40, there are many things you can't do. You can't play with your grandkids. You can't run after a ball. There are many things in life which become very unpleasant, I think, if you're carrying that many kilos around. I'm not trying to fat shame people here. I'm just trying to say, is there a positive message here that you can, or a way you could say, in the past we were cigarette shaming people, but it was very effective. I think we should learn from it.
Good.
Comments on that, but Roz? You look like you're on mute.
I apologize. Yeah, I'm actually an economist by training and teach courses in resource and environmental economics. And I often use a piece written by Tony Judt, who wrote about whatever happened to social democracy. And he's really looking at how the economics profession as a whole really transformed from thinking about society as a whole and the invisible hand that would work well for all, to just consumers and producers, and it's all economic. And I think that this transition has been highlighted and underscored so much during the COVID epidemic, particularly in the United States. And I would say the US is much worse than Europe on this. Ricardo Salvador gave a really interesting talk earlier on the COVID, where all of a sudden meat packing was an essential service, where the justice aspects of bringing in underserved and minority workers to have to work in these plants to give us this food we probably shouldn't necessarily be eating so much of it anyway, was all part of this system of our economy and who has power in our economy. It's the economic large players here. And so this citizen versus consumer is really an important one, because I think we've transformed to looking at consumers. And only recently, I think there's a lot of hope in the US, especially with the diversity riots and so forth, that people reach a point where they're just going to take to the streets. And this gets to what Cynthia was talking about, what's needed for the transformation. At one level, it's got to be bottom up. It's not going to be top down, because the top down is is in this system right now, that it is about consumers and about an economic business model that may not work for all of us.
Could I just introduce something else? I talked to Christy before. That I live in Denmark, and if you take the Scandinavian countries and also Finland, the Nordic country, then they all have AAA Standard & Poor's economic ratings, and we have high salaries, we have high taxes, we have free education. My daughter goes to one of the best universities or she went to one of the best universities in Europe. And we didn't pay anything. She, in fact, was supported by the state for that. And this is an example of how this system that was developed in the Scandinavian countries didn't just happen by chance. It came out of a movement which basically started in the 1800s, and before that as well, a cooperative movement. And it was called people building, and it basically started off as an educational program. For farmers, in fact, to increase their knowledge of agriculture. And then they said, okay, well, we need to have a generally well-educated society. And this story has been told in a book called the Nordic Secret, which is basically a story of how the Scandinavian and Nordic countries in the 1800s were the poorest in Europe. You've seen mass emigrations from these countries to North America. Why would that happen? Because they were having famines and they couldn't feed themselves. But in the process, they then said, okay, how do we get away from this? How do we build a people? And if you have a chance to see this book called The Nordic Secret, it's written in English by a Danish woman and a Swedish guy. It's a very interesting story of how you can move from being one of the poorest countries in Europe to being one of the most wealthy, and also have a very, very high standard of living and all the kind of things that we like to have. And it is possible. It takes time, and it does mean that you have to have policies. I mean, you have to policies, and there has to be trust. One of the very important things in Scandinavian countries is the fact that they have a lot of trust. People trust each other. And that's an enormous economic advantage. I'll stop my sermon from here.
I would say I wish we had the same trust in the US. That seems to be eroding, but hopefully we can get it back.
Well, I was going to say, I live in Seattle, where many people from those countries moved during those famines, and it's made a difference in the culture of Seattle.
Yes.
I wanted to just pick up briefly on a comment John's mentioned a couple of times of what can we learn about tobacco. Part of the answer is secondhand tobacco smoke kills people. And so it wasn't just what you were doing affecting yourself, it was what you were doing that was affecting other people. And so that was part of it. But a big part of it was doing social science research. And the tobacco story is a long story because there was lots of messaging that didn't work. And so thinking about consumers as citizens and thinking about the various topics you've all raised about ensuring that people really understand that food is a system. It's not just it's not what I buy in my local grocery store. It's not the amazing hypocrisy of my store who's got great big signs that say buy local, and underneath it is all produce from South America. Depends on how you frame local, isn't it? But we do need to understand what motivates behavior, what motivates that consumer demand. We understand in some places, some of those incentives, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And that is how tobacco ended up being so successful, is from decades of failure in not being able to really effectively communicate those messages. And so thinking about the social sciences and the different ways it needs to engage in the discussions we're having right now. And so that when we talk about having a resilient and sustainable food system, that the social science is there to help inform the transitions that you're all talking about. Roz?
And yeah, no, this is a really important point. And, in the field of economics, behavioral economics has become a very well recognized field with a recent Nobel laureate in this area. Whereas earlier it was thought, oh, these people are just telling stories and so forth. But people's behavior is not quote unquote rational according to, their economic incentives. There's so much to behavior. And I think some of the things that I've seen both at the very local level and from the top down on how do you transition behavior, particularly with kids, and getting kids really interested in what they eat and engaged in a food system earlier in their lives has been important, not just through TV commercials and then wanting to buy certain things, but within the school systems, actually growing and participating in the foods that they eat. Actually, when I went to grade school many decades ago now, we had home ec. We actually all had to take this, and we were kind of aware of the things we did on a day-to-day basis to take care of ourselves. And that needs to come back as a core part of curriculum, I think, for kids everywhere, because they will need to feed themselves, and it is a matter of health as well as nutrition. And I really thought Michelle Obama, in taking this on as her issue as the first lady, was very, it was really illustrative of how leadership can make a difference. It was so positive. It wasn't just focused on all the negative stuff. She was trying to avoid that by just engaging kids and making them part of a solution. And then, of course, those kids come back to their families and say, no, I want to do something different. And how about this and that? I mean, even my daughter does that all the time. And so, I think it kind of starts from the bottom up in that way too, but having some good mentors and leadership helps a lot.
And as you well know, it's leadership at all scales.
Yes.
So Berkeley has a world famous chef who's been engaging with the local middle school for a couple of decades,
Yeah.
pretty much forever, and it is difference at the local level. And so you do need all scales. And that goes to Cindy's point of how do we start flipping a system. And so it is that engagement at all scales from people who are committed to really making a difference in increasing resiliency and sustainability. Which leads to a question that most of you raised and we haven't talked about explicitly, is how to help facilitate this in the low and middle income countries, or in the very low income segments of our own communities where there are food deserts, and how to reach into a much broader community, into the larger humanity that doesn't have access to the resources. And that is resources at all scales. It's not just financial resources, it's knowledge, it's access to computers, it's access to being able to get the education to make the kinds of choices we've all been advocating for.
Yeah. Not everybody's going to jump right in there. Yeah, I think to try and get resources to that sector of our population is tough. Now, I have seen USDA funding that is all about trying to address food deserts, and perhaps we need to double down in that arena. They have made some improvements also with food stamps and SNAP funding, so that those are also eligible for farmers markets. So, to try and get both of those programs to work together so that we could get more farmers markets into food deserts, and they can use their food stamps to kind of get that to happen, I think is would be ideal. I have seen some in California, at least. I have seen where we're getting farmers markets in places where we never had before. Obviously, with COVID, that all came to a screeching halt. But the farmer market, industry, is very vibrant here. And I think that without a doubt, we need to get it into places where, the south side of Orville, perhaps. I mean, that's in my local community. They could really use a farmer's market there with fresh fruit and vegetables that are available at a price that they can afford. That would be lovely.
And Roz, it sounds like the work that you're doing on Blue Food is coming at this from another perspective.
Yeah, well, food is so cultural. And so I'm just thinking of how it really, different food systems emerge in different countries. And I work in a lot of different countries. And so I was just running through so many of them. On the Blue Foods, I gave the example of South Asia, where all these small, medium-sized enterprises have just popped up because they see a demand for protein and local and regional foods that is there, and entrepreneurs have just stepped in and made this happen. That would be very different than what you see in some other parts, say, of Africa, where the transportation networks might not be as good and the cultural situation is worse. I was thinking, in terms of really being able to benefit different local populations, part of it is providing the right incentives to get there, and part is getting rid of policies that are creating sort of perpetuating the same food system that we have. I've got 2 projects in India right now where India has really supported rice, wheat, sugar, some of these basic crops. There's a political economy built up behind it because the producers that benefit from that are now the policymakers in their states, and they perpetuate this and so forth. And it's not been until this COVID disruption, where the supply chains really broke down, that the Indian government is thinking, well, maybe we won't have these kind of subsidies on electricity to pump the groundwater to do, but we'll put those subsidies into more localized markets and let farmers decide what they want to grow. So maybe it does require, I think Cynthia raised this, a disruption to get there and say, let's let a new system emerge. So some of it is saying don't, and some of it is trying to embrace the sort of localized culture and food demands that you see out there.
And that leads to another question from the audience about local gardens. And there were several mentions in your comments about having local gardens, thinking about urban agriculture, and the extent to which this could help with some of the big questions that we're trying to address.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The local gardens are good.
Well, local gardens are phenomenal, and I think every school should have one. And I think that has been a big boon. I give talks regularly to the master gardeners in our region. I know that the UC Cooperative Extension is highly involved there as well. And that whole idea is to kind of create those kinds of opportunities in our K through 12 and also in our local communities. And, and here, this really ties back well to the food desert issue. We had community gardens in all the low income housing areas. Just think how much better or improve the health and wellness would be in those regions, and how to get that to happen. I mean, there again is another sea change in policy with respect to how we allocate funding. And that to me is really an important piece when we can make this kind of nutritious food available to all sectors of our population, not just those that are wealthy enough to afford it.
And a related question to this is, there are several questions that have come up about contamination, how to ensure food safety, everything from microplastics in the ocean, Roz, to the quality of soils. We know that in many of our poor and marginalized communities, there's high level of lead in soils, and growing crops, when you have high levels of lead, has issues itself, and how to ensure the overall food safety as we think about this agricultural transition.
I no doubt about that. There are scavenger plants that could be used in order to kind of suck some of that out of those heavy metal soils. And I know that it is done and has been done. I know that there's been some bioengineering that's been done on some biological tools that have also been very, very helpful in terms of remediating some of these contaminated soils. It's a problem. We do have soils that are so contaminated that you really can't grow a crop on them. So, I think remediation measures, to treat that like a Superfund site, because we're losing soil on a regular basis. I think that the amount of ag land that's being consumed for urban development and other types of commercialization is very dramatic. So we don't have any soil to spare. And that's on a square footage basis. And that's also, from a soil depth perspective. I mean, we keep eroding through our topsoil. That's a valuable national treasure that needs to be more appreciated and supported. Again, it shows another deficiency, I think, in our current system. I'm full of bad. Maybe we ought to talk about some good things too.
When I moved to Copenhagen in 1995, I was given a fair amount of money by the Danish research councils, and they said, you can do whatever you want with this money. So I said, okay, what I want to do is to establish an agricultural production system which is fossil fuel energy neutral, in that it produces as much renewable energy as is being consumed in the production of food. And we made it into an organic system. But in between the organic fields, we had these belts of fast-growing energy crops, or energy trees. They're actually willows and other fast-growing trees. And one of the things that these fast-growing trees do is actually very good at picking up heavy metals from the soil, particularly cadmium. They're very well known as. And what happens every 3 or 4 years is that these biomass belts are harvested and they're taken across to a combined heat and power station and then turned into electricity. So there are ways that I think you can think about how you can use soils which are carrying heavy metals by thinking about how they can be extracted from things that you don't eat, but you use for another socially valuable function like producing energy. And what we've also done in this work, I mean, it started off as this idea of how, and it is, I mean, it is a fossil fuel energy neutral system. We produce more energy than we consume. Is to look at the ecosystem services in the system. It's called a combined food and energy system. And we started in the 2000 something to look at the ecosystem services in this system. So we've tried to develop a system whereby and what's interesting really is even though we're using 10% of the land to produce the energy crops, our yields per hectare or per area are because of the ecosystem services in the system are more than 10% larger than the average you get in organic systems in Denmark. So we're not actually losing any yield. This is an organic system that we're running, and because we're using ecosystem services in the system, our yields per hectare are, as I say, 10% higher. So they're offsetting the extra land that we have to use for biomass. In fact, what we're really doing is increasing the land use ratio. That's what it would be called, the land use ratio. And you can use the fast-growing trees as an energy source, and then you can get rid of some of these heavy metals as well. So you have to think out of the box and diversify. This is an example of how you build robustness, I think.
When I think of toxins, when I get into the realm of toxins, I think that's the most depressing issue of all. I mean, because they're everywhere. And like John said about climate, this is very much a macro issue. It's not all a micro issue. And just even looking at the past 4 years in the United States, how we've deregulated and taken away a lot of the restrictions on toxins by the EPA, for example. I mean, that then just leads into all aspects of our food system, because these things float around all the way up to the poles. I mean, they're everywhere. And so we may think that's an industry issue, but it's really a food issue too. There are ecosystem services in the blue food realm, if you think about seaweeds that have been really highly promoted recently, or mollusks, different bivalves to take up nutrients and purify water and so forth. But as you think about that, they're also taking up whatever toxins are in there. So the food safety aspects, would you eat a clam outside of Beijing or Shanghai? I wouldn't, or in many parts of anywhere in the world, including the United States, you have to really worry about how clean that water would be. And when we think about the global distribution of consumers as well as producers in the world, I mean, they're in lower income settings that aren't that clean. And so, so the justice aspects, who can afford to really ensure that they have a complete food safe situation, as opposed to just having food, is really unbalanced, to be honest. I mean, just go around the world and see, most people have to put food safety second to just having food.
Having enough food.
And it goes back to a comment from Cindy of the nutrient density. It's just not a priority. It's calories. It's not nutrient density. And moving.
What do you? Sorry, what do you mean by nutrient? I'm not sure I understand what you mean by nutrient density. What do you mean by that?
So, for example, under higher carbon dioxide, there's a 10% reduction in protein.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a significant reduction in micronutrients and even larger vitamins.
Yeah.
And so
okay.
Food is less nutrient dense.
Yes. Okay, I got it.
Particularly just to produce calories. Just
Yeah.
how
Empty calories, as they're called. Yeah.
Quality of the food. Then will perpetuate. In fact, we're going to exacerbate the challenges we have right now with nutrition. The estimates of the number of people potentially affected later in the century is in the hundreds of millions.
I mean, I think there was a move in the IPCC, and I think particularly in the last special report. I mean, the one that they've just done now, which was led by Cynthia Rosenzweig. And I think the debate has really moved on. I mean, I think when we did the fifth assessment report, the food security and food production systems, we did make steps, I think, to look at these other issues. But I don't think we did it as much as we were relying on the evidence and we were relying on the papers. But since then, I think the debate has really become much more sophisticated, I think, in terms of new food. It's food and nutritional security now. It's not just food security, which is, the comfort zone of scientists is produce more, is to grow bigger crops. And now we're recognizing that more from less is not good enough. We have to have enough from less. That's my new mantra.
I like it. Ross, did you want to come in on that?
No, I mean, the debate really has shifted when you go to these biannual food security conferences and so forth. It's all about nutrition security and how do you transform, what we're looking at in the goals. The recent state of food insecurity in the world focuses on this completely as well. A healthy, more nutritious food system, and so it just came out this week. And so I think the focus really is changing, and that's going to help a lot in terms of the funding that goes out to help different regions of the world, really establish different kinds of food systems. I mean, there still are pretty powerful players in the global food system that want to keep the status quo, and we'll see what happens to them.
Just to pick up on that, Ross, the CGIAR is being reorganized at the moment. So the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, for people who don't know what that is, this is the UN Organization for Agricultural Research. This has been reorganized at the moment. And they're trying to make it into one CGAIR. I actually chair the wheat committee of that. But the point is, one of the reasons for doing this is because of the priorities of funding organizations now. The funding organizations do definitely want to talk about food security, and they want to look at the links between food security and pandemics. So the debate, and this is, Gates, this is the big funders, and also the governmental funders as well, not just the philanthropic funders, but their emphasis is really, really changing. And the one CGAR wants to pick up on this by having a single organization where they can think about food systems. If you look at the literature now from the CGAIR, the CG Institutes, they're talking about food systems. And that is because they can see which way the money's going to go.
And that leads to probably our last question, and it's a bundled question. From the perspective of researchers who've been listening to this rich discussion, who would like to get into this area, where can they go to look for funding, which in the United States is a particular challenge because the food system crosses multiple federal agencies, and mission mandates means it's difficult to do multidisciplinary work. And the second part of the question is from more or less the practitioners. You've presented a rich amount of experience. And if someone wanted to go do something, where could they go get more information? If, for example, they wanted to start a local food garden, if there's some other interventions that they wanted to take on the local level. So thinking across the range of actors that are important in this area, where would you suggest people start?
You don't ask easy questions, do you, Chris?
You didn't sign up for easy questions, did you?
You're not for the easy, the easy ones.
It wouldn't be fun if it was all easy. Come on, John.
No, indeed, it wouldn't be fun if it was easy. I agree about that. I mean, where can you get funding from? I mean, I think you have to. I'm involved in this One Planet Fellowship program here and that is meant to be giving a leg up to young researchers from Africa and also from Europe about climate change. And this is funded by Gates. It's funded by Gates and it's funded by BNP Paribas in France with Macron, and also by the European Commission. And I think that's if you're gonna get money out of research organizations, you've got to have a reasonably good track record. You've got to have some good ideas, and you've got to be in a good group. So I would suggest, if you want, for young researchers, they've got to look around and see how they can get into the heavy hitters in terms of, places like Stanford, for example, David Lebel, wonderful researcher. And but also the other big hitters. So you've got to be in the right place at the right time, I think. And then doors will open for you, I think. I mean, there are some places, who always get money. I'm thinking about the European Union's research programs now. There are some places which always get money. And so you have to find out who those are and get in and get into that organization, I think. I have no idea how I could answer the second part of your question. I'm sorry.
Well, I would add to that, John, that you can collaborate, that you don't have to be in the group, but you can also start developing collaborations.
Right.
And that would be a way to move forward.
Right. Yeah, I would argue that systems-based research really demands collaboration between different disciplines, I think, in order to really have an effective research proposal approach to some of these, what I hope is, designs into these kinds of complex systems. It requires this interdisciplinary approach. And there are, the funding through USDA, at least it's very, very competitive, but there are a lot of different funding divisions, a lot of different funding programs, and they're very good at telling you just how often, or just what the funding rate is, how much money is available and how many proposals they receive, and of those proposals, how many are actually funded. And we've been very successful, when, even if you get denied the first time around, take those reviewer comments and then resubmit. That's been a very, very valuable approach, because that's basically your guideline to get funding. There may be ways that you can misinterpret an RFP, and then, you kind of go off on left field. And those reviewer comments will get you back targeted and reapply, go apply the next time around. And I completely agree with John on collaborators, trying to find those individuals with like minds that want to go down that same path with you. That's very helpful to mentor you and to also support you, and developing a research program that is meaningful and fulfilling. With respect to where to go for funding, I mean, you still need to go to the USDA's, and we have a wonderful thing. It's in our region, it's Western Sustainable Ag. That's also been a great place for us to go for this kind of systems like research or foundations. And I know that sounds a little precarious, but foundations have been wonderful supporters, and are often looking to try and support research in systems-based, regenerative or sustainable or climate smart agriculture. I mean, I see them stepping up to the plate, because they realize that a lot of the funding has been taken out of the federal government, and it's very hard for a lot of our institutions to rely upon that general funding from the general budget to make things happen. I'm seeing a lot of my colleagues in the cooperative extension are going out to foundations more so now than ever before. And that's because there has been this reduction in the general funding for extension. Those folks are doing an amazing job, trying to do work in almonds or walnuts or a row crop in 5 counties. It's crazy what they're expecting them to do. So we like building collaborations with them, and then figuring out some very creative ways to go to foundations to get funding to do collaborative work. Collaboration is the new normal.
Yeah, these two have covered all my points. Like, and I get asked this question by students every week, so it's really tough. The internet also does really help on a localized level. There's so many local groups that have sprung up. Even one of my students joined a student group at Stanford to create a whole new NGO during COVID that linked producers that had all this excess produce to food banks that actually could use more food during this COVID process, and especially food banks that were not as central, like in major urban areas. And so the ingenuity has been really good, but that's all been based on social media sort of connections that they have been able to discover some of the ability to grow in this environment. I couldn't even advise them on that, to be honest. But the points John and Cynthia made were just bang on.
I mean, I think there has been a change in. I mean, I remember when I lived in Liverpool, and the local grocer would deliver our groceries every week, and my mother would phone him up or phone the grocers up, and they would come with a package of groceries every week, and that has kind of been reinvented. In fact, I think. I mean, this is what I've been seeing in Denmark. I mean, when there was the lockdown, people developed these. Even wine was being delivered, which is thankful. We were thankful for that, so. But I mean, it did offer some, for adventurous and people who were prepared to take a chance. It opened up another avenue of business, I think, and as we heard from the States as well. I mean, the people who are doing the deliveries have. This has been an opening for them. And, maybe this is a line that farmers need to think of as well, about how they get, they don't just, they get their food out to their customers, and things may, things change, huh? Things may change.
Well, thank you, John. That's going to have to be the last word, leaving on a very positive note that things do change. We know they need to change, and they are changing. I want to thank the 3 of you very much for really interesting sets of presentations and discussions. I want to thank the audience for the excellent questions. My apologies, we couldn't answer all of them, but hopefully we answered enough of them and piqued your interest. And with that, Naomi, would you like to tell us what's going to happen tomorrow?
Oops, sorry. I wasn't, I thought you were closing out, but I do think it's been an outstanding day, and I appreciate everyone hanging in there and listening to it. And there are so many other questions that are still brewing, but we're looking forward to tomorrow, where we're going to talk about the future and what changes will occur at that time. So it'll be promptly at 10 o'clock. And we hope everyone else will be able to join us. And knowing that all of this has been recorded and will be posted on the website, Food Forum website, in the next week or two. So thank you, Chris, and thank you to all of the speakers and to all of our support. It's been an outstanding day.